Australia presents itself as a young, fair-go nation built on sunshine and easy optimism. What they taught in school was a curated version of that story. Tonight, 99 truths they buried, minimized, or hoped you would never think to ask about. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Number 1. The First Fleet was not a colonization mission in any dignified sense. When the First Fleet arrived at Botany Bay in January of 1788, it was not the beginning of a great civilizing project. It was the dumping of surplus human beings that Britain could no longer afford to house in its overflowing prisons. The American Revolution had closed off the previous dumping ground for convicts. Britain needed somewhere else. Australia was chosen because it was far enough away that the people sent there would likely never come back, and because the Dutch, French, and British explorers who had sighted the continent had confirmed it was inhabitable. The convicts were not settlers in any meaningful voluntary sense. They were transported under sentence, often for crimes as minor as stealing a loaf of bread or a handkerchief. The transportation system reflected the British class system in its most extreme form. The property of the powerful was protected by the bodies of the poor. The idea that Australia was founded as a grand colonial enterprise obscures the reality that it was founded as a prison. Number 2. The Eora people of Sydney had no say in any of it. The Eora people had lived in the Sydney Basin for at least 65,000 years before the First Fleet arrived. Their knowledge of the harbour, its fish populations, its seasonal patterns, and the land surrounding it was comprehensive in ways that the colonists, who were struggling to feed themselves in the first years of the settlement, could not begin to approach. Their population in the Sydney region has been estimated at several thousand, organised into clan groups with detailed knowledge of the land, sophisticated legal and ceremonial traditions, complex kinship systems, and a relationship with the harbour and its resources that sustained them through millennia of climate variation. When the British arrived, they did not make a treaty. They did not ask permission. They did not acknowledge that the land belonged to anyone. They simply declared it terra nullius, a Latin phrase meaning land belonging to no one, and proceeded to occupy it. The Eora people, who had been managing that land for longer than any currently recognized civilization, had no legal standing in this framework. Their presence was acknowledged as a practical inconvenience, not as a legal fact. Number 3. Smallpox killed half the Aboriginal population of the Sydney region within 2 years. In 1789, 14 months after the First Fleet's arrival, a catastrophic smallpox epidemic swept through the Aboriginal communities of the Sydney region. The mortality rate was devastating. In some communities, every single person died. The Aboriginal population of the Sydney Basin is estimated to have been reduced by approximately 50% within a 2-year period. The colonists watched it happen. Governor Arthur Phillip noted it in his dispatches to London with a mixture of scientific curiosity and practical relief. The clinical detachment with which colonial officials documented the deaths of Aboriginal people is one of the most disturbing features of the documentary record of early Australian colonisation. The epidemic conveniently cleared much of the land the colonists needed. There has been persistent historical debate about whether the epidemic was deliberately started by the colonists, who had bottles of smallpox variola material aboard the First Fleet for medical purposes. The debate has never been definitively resolved, but the circumstantial evidence, the timing, the specific nature of the disease, the presence of the material aboard the fleet has been examined seriously by historians, including Christopher Warren, and others who have concluded that deliberate infection is at least as plausible as accidental spread. Number 4. The Sydney Cove massacre was covered up by the colonial government. In December of 1790, Governor Phillip's gamekeeper, John McIntyre, was speared by an Aboriginal man named Pemulwuy near Botany Bay. Phillip responded by organising a punitive expedition under Captain Watkin Tench, ordering his soldiers to capture or kill 10 Aboriginal people and return with their heads. The expedition was sent. What actually happened during it was never fully reported. And historians have long suspected that killings took place that were deliberately omitted from the official account. The culture of covering up retaliatory massacres began before the colony was 5 years old and continued for another 200 years. Pemulwuy himself became one of the first organised resistors to colonial expansion, conducting guerrilla warfare against the settlers for over a decade before being shot and killed in 1802. His head was removed and sent to England. It has never been returned. Number 5. The preamble to the Australian Constitution does not mention Aboriginal people. The Australian Constitution, passed by the British Parliament in 1900, and which came into effect on the first day of 1901, does not mention Aboriginal Australians at any point. They are entirely absent from the founding legal document of the nation. This was not an oversight. The framers of the Constitution debated whether to include Aboriginal people in the census and population counts and specifically decided against it. The reasoning was explicit. Aboriginal people were not considered part of the body politic. They were not citizens. They were not counted. They were not acknowledged. The Constitution that created Australia legally erased the people who had been there for 65,000 years. Number 6. Aboriginal Australians could not vote in federal elections until 1962. When Australia became a nation in 1901, its Aboriginal citizens were excluded from federal voting rights in most states. Some states had previously extended voting rights to Aboriginal people. But the federation process created a constitution that left voting rights largely to state discretion and excluded Aboriginal people from the federal franchise in practice. The formal right to vote in federal elections was not extended to all Aboriginal Australians until the Commonwealth Electoral Act of 1962, 61 years after federation. It is worth noting that the state of Queensland did not extend the state franchise to Aboriginal people until 1965. And Western Australia had restrictions in place that operated similarly. This is not ancient colonial history. This is within the lifetimes of people who are still alive today. The comparison with South Africa's apartheid system, which was internationally condemned for denying black citizens the vote, is one that historians raise with increasing frequency. The comparison with South Africa's apartheid system, which was internationally condemned for denying black South Africans the vote, is one that Australian historians have raised with increasing frequency as scrutiny of Australia's racial history has grown. Number 7. The Protection Acts were a legal framework for slavery. Between the 1880s and the 1960s, every Australian state and territory passed legislation called Protection Acts, which gave government-appointed protectors of Aborigines total legal authority over the lives of Aboriginal people. Protectors could determine where Aboriginal people could live, who they could marry, whether they could work and for whom, whether they could receive wages or have those wages confiscated and held in government accounts, and whether children could be removed from their families. The system functioned as a comprehensive mechanism of social control. Aboriginal workers were commonly employed on cattle stations across northern and western Australia for rations and minimal or no cash wages, a system that persisted into the 1960s and that the pastoral industry depended on and defended. The wages that were confiscated and held in government accounts were frequently never returned. Studies by the Queensland government alone found that hundreds of millions of dollars in unpaid and stolen wages may have been owed to Aboriginal workers under the Protection Acts. Number 8. The Myall Creek Massacre and the trial that shocked the squatters. On June 10, 1838, on a property called Myall Creek Station in what is now New South Wales, a group of stockmen and station workers rounded up between 28 and 35 Aboriginal people, mostly women, children, and elderly men from the Wiraere clan who had been living peacefully at the station, and systematically killed them with swords. The bodies were burned. 11 men were charged with murder. In an unprecedented act of colonial justice, 7 of them were convicted and hanged. The response from the settler community was outrage, not at the massacre, but at the conviction. Squatters and pastoralists across the colony were furious that white men had been executed for killing Aboriginal people. The lesson the massacre and its aftermath taught to the colonial establishment was not that massacres were wrong. It was that if you committed them, you should make sure there were no witnesses and leave no evidence. Number 9. The frontier wars killed more people than Gallipoli. Australia has a national mythology built substantially around Gallipoli, the World War I campaign in which approximately 8,500 Australians were killed. It is the central event of Australian national identity, commemorated every year on Anzac Day, as a founding moment of national character. The frontier wars between colonists and Aboriginal people, which began in 1788 and continued in some regions until the 1920s, killed Aboriginal people in numbers that dwarf Gallipoli. Estimates of Aboriginal deaths from frontier violence vary considerably depending on methodology, but historians including Henry Reynolds have documented killings numbering in the tens of thousands. Thus, with some estimates for total Aboriginal deaths across the frontier period running to 45,000 or more. These wars have no national day of commemoration. The word war is itself contested in Australian public discourse as applied to these events. The asymmetry between how Australia commemorates the deaths of soldiers overseas and how it treats the deaths of Aboriginal people defending their own land is one of the most telling features of Australian national identity. Number 10. The Coniston Massacre of 1928. In August and September of 1928, a series of killings occurred in the Northern Territory. Following the murder of a dingo trapper named Frederick Brooks, Constable George Murray led a series of punitive expeditions against the Warlpiri, Anmatiere, and Kaitachi peoples of the region. The official government inquiry found that 31 Aboriginal people had been killed. Eyewitness accounts and subsequent historical research suggest the number was considerably higher, with some estimates running to over 100. Murray was found to have acted reasonably by the official inquiry. He received no punishment. The Northern Territory was not administered under the same legal standards as the states, which gave the pastoral and police establishments of the territory a degree of impunity that was widely understood and regularly exploited. The Coniston Massacre, which occurred in the reign of George V, within living memory of people still alive in the late 20th century, is not widely taught in Australian schools. Number 11. Aboriginal children were removed from families, as government policy for decades. The removal of Aboriginal children from their families was not an isolated practice of individual zealots. It was formal government policy, implemented systematically across Australia from the late 19th century through to the 1970s. The policy was justified at various times on grounds of welfare, of civilization, of protection, and of assimilation. The terminology changed across the decades, but the underlying goal remained constant: the elimination of Aboriginal cultural distinctiveness through the removal of children from the communities and families that transmitted it. The actual effect was the deliberate destruction of Aboriginal family structures, communities, and cultures. Children were taken to institutions and missions where they were forbidden to speak their languages or maintain any connection to their cultures. They were trained as domestic servants and agricultural laborers for white employers. Many experienced physical and sexual abuse in these institutions. The people who were removed as children and their descendants are collectively known as the Stolen Generations. The Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission's Bringing Them Home report of 1997 found that the removal practices met the United Nations definition of genocide. Number 12. The apology came 120 years late. When Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered the national apology to the Stolen Generations on February 13, 2008, it was treated as a significant and emotional national moment. Many Aboriginal people wept. Many Australians watching felt genuine emotion. What the apology represented, beyond its emotional significance, was the formal acknowledgement by a federal government that something had been done that was wrong. Previous Prime Minister John Howard had refused to apologise for over a decade, arguing that Australians living today should not apologise for the actions of previous generations. His refusal was not a marginal position. It had significant public support. The apology came without the financial reparations that many Stolen Generation survivors and advocates had called for. The decision to separate the apology from material redress reflected a political calculation about what the Australian public would accept, and that calculation said more about the limits of national willingness to acknowledge responsibility than about justice. The government explicitly linked the apology to future closing the gap policies, rather than to compensation for the specific harm done to specific people. Many survivors said the apology was meaningful but inadequate. They were right on both counts. Number 13. The White Australia policy was not a fringe view. It was a founding principle, the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, passed as one of the very first acts of the new Australian Parliament, implemented what became known as the White Australia policy. It was not a policy that was reluctantly adopted under political pressure from extremists. It was a founding principle of the Federation, enthusiastically supported by the Labour movement, as the major parties, and the majority of the white Australian public. The specific mechanism was a dictation test, administered in any European language the immigration officer chose, and the test was applied selectively. A person the immigration officer wanted to exclude would be tested in a language they were known not to speak, making exclusion a bureaucratic certainty, which was used to exclude non-white immigrants regardless of their actual qualifications or circumstances. Alfred Deakin, one of the founding fathers of Australia, was explicit about the policy's racial motivation. It was not repealed until the immigration reforms of the 1960s and 70s under Harold Holt and Gough Whitlam. The effects of the policy on Australian society, culture, and demographics are still being felt today. Number 14. Chinese Australians were taxed for existing Chinese migrants had come to Australia in significant numbers during the gold rushes of the 1850s. They were experienced miners, hardworking, and willing to work ground that white miners had abandoned as insufficiently profitable. The white mining community's response was to campaign for their exclusion. Victoria and New South Wales passed legislation in the 1850s imposing a poll tax on Chinese immigrants and restricting the number who could arrive on any single ship. Anti-Chinese riots occurred at Lambing Flat in New South Wales in 1860 and 61, in which thousands of white miners attacked Chinese camps, burning them and assaulting their inhabitants, in some of the worst race riots in Australian history. The rioters faced minimal legal consequences. The government responded not by protecting the Chinese victims, but by strengthening the exclusionary legislation. Number 15. The Lambing Flat riots and the banner that hung in a museum. The banner that the anti-Chinese rioters at Lambing Flat carried, a crude flag reading, roll up, no Chinese, was preserved and for many years displayed at the Young and District Museum in New South Wales as a historical artefact. The question of how to display symbols of racial violence in public collections is one that Australian museums and heritage institutions have been working through with increasing seriousness in recent years. The banner was eventually removed from display after Indigenous and Chinese community groups pointed out that displaying a symbol of racial violence as a curiosity, rather than confronting its meaning, was inappropriate. The Lambing Flat riots are one of the more viscerally documented examples of early Australian racism, but they are far from unique. The pattern of violent exclusion of non-white workers from the colonial economy repeated itself across the country throughout the 19th century. Number 16. The Kanaka trade was effectively slavery. Between 1863 and 1904, an estimated 62,000 Pacific Islander workers, known as Kanakas, were brought to Queensland to work on sugar plantations. The conditions under which they were recruited were frequently fraudulent, with workers having little understanding of the terms of their indenture or the conditions they would face. Many were taken by force in a practice known as blackbirding. The mortality rate was extremely high. Workers died from disease, from harsh working conditions, and from violence. When the Federation government passed the Pacific Island Labourers Act in 1901, it required the deportation of Pacific Islander workers in order to preserve the White Australia policy. Thousands of people who had lived in Queensland for years, some for decades, and who had built lives and families there, were forcibly shipped back to islands some of them had never known as adults. The sugar industry that their labour had built continued to profit without them. Number 17. The North Australia pastoral industry ran on unpaid Aboriginal labour for decades. The cattle industry of the Northern Territory and Western Australia was built substantially on the labour of Aboriginal workers, particularly from the early 20th century through the 1960s. These workers received rations and minimal or no cash wages. They had no right under the Protection Acts to refuse employment, to leave their station without permission, or to receive the wages that their white counterparts would have received for the same work. Station owners lobbied actively against any reform that would have required them to pay Aboriginal workers award wages, arguing that their operations could not survive at those wage levels. When the Arbitration Commission determined in 1965 that Aboriginal workers in the pastoral industry were entitled to equal pay beginning in 1968, many station owners responded by dismissing their Aboriginal workforce entirely rather than paying them equally. The consequence was a wave of dispossession as Aboriginal families lost access to the stations where they had lived and worked for generations. Number 18. The Wave Hill Walk-Off and the Land, that took 9 years to return. In August of 1966, Gurindji workers led by Vincent Lingiari walked off the Wave Hill cattle station in the Northern Territory, in what became one of the most significant labour and land rights actions in Australian history. The walk-off was initially about wages and working conditions on the Vesti Brothers station, where Aboriginal workers received minimal rations and lived in conditions that were widely compared to servitude. The protest evolved into a land rights claim. The Gurindji wanted back a portion of their traditional country that Wave Hill Station had been built on. The response from the Vesti Brothers, one of the wealthiest pastoral companies in the world, and from the federal government under Harold Holt and then John Gorton, was to resist. The walk-off lasted 9 years. In 1975, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam flew to Dagaragu and in a ceremony that became one of the most famous photographs in Australian political history, poured red earth through Vincent Lingiari's hands as a symbolic return of the land. The legal title, Hayat covering a fraction of the original Gurindji country, was formally returned. Whitlam was dismissed from office by the Governor-General 3 months later. Number 19. Gough Whitlam's dismissal, and the question that never got a proper answer. On November 11, 1975, Governor-General Sir John Kerr dismissed Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, who commanded a majority in the House of Representatives, because the opposition-controlled Senate had refused to pass the government's budget. The dismissal was constitutionally controversial and is still debated by legal scholars. What is less frequently discussed is what Kerr did in the lead-up to the dismissal. He consulted with the Chief Justice of the High Court, Sir Garfield Barwick, without informing the Prime Minister. He received advice that supported the dismissal. He then acted without warning or consultation. In 2012, correspondence between Kerr and Buckingham Palace was declassified and revealed that Kerr had been in communication with the Queen's private secretary about the crisis. The full extent of those communications was not fully public until 2020, when historian Jenny Hocking won a legal battle to release the palace letters. They revealed that Kerr had kept the palace informed of his intentions and had received support rather than discouragement. The question of whether the dismissal was the result of a conspiracy involving the palace, the CIA, which was concerned about Whitlam's government, and domestic conservative interests, has been argued by serious historians and never definitively resolved. What is clear is that the official account of the dismissal as a straightforward constitutional act is not the complete story. Number 20. Aboriginal people were not counted in the national census until 1971. The Commonwealth Constitution specifically excluded Aboriginal people from being counted in the census, and this exclusion remained in place until the 1967 referendum changed it. The referendum, which passed with a remarkable 90.5% of the vote, made 2 changes to the Constitution. It gave the federal government power to make laws for Aboriginal people, and it removed the exclusion from the census. But even after the referendum, the inclusion of Aboriginal people in the census was not immediate. The census of 1971 was the first in which Aboriginal people were systematically included. The practical consequence of being excluded from the census for 7 decades of federation was that Aboriginal communities had no official statistical existence, which made it nearly impossible to direct government resources to their needs or to measure the impact of policies on their lives. Number 21. The Stolen Wages of Queensland. The Protection Acts in Queensland gave the government the authority to control the wages of Aboriginal workers, a power that was used not merely to delay payment, but in many cases to divert those wages permanently into consolidated revenue or to use them for purposes that had nothing to do with the interests of the workers to whom the money belonged, us depositing them into government trust accounts rather than paying them directly. This practice continued in various forms from the late 19th century through to 1972. Studies commissioned by the Queensland government in the late 1990s and early 2000s found that hundreds of millions of dollars in wages and savings had been held in these accounts, that the records were incomplete and frequently inaccurate, and that the money held in trust had often been used for purposes other than the benefit of the workers to whom it belonged. Reparation schemes were eventually established, but the amounts offered were widely considered inadequate. Many claimants had died by the time any compensation was available. Their children and grandchildren received no benefit. Number 22. The first Australians survived the last ice age. One of the most extraordinary facts about Aboriginal Australians that Australian school curricula have consistently underemphasised is the sheer antiquity of their presence on the continent. Modern genetic and archaeological research has established that Aboriginal Australians are the descendants of one of the first modern human migrations out of Africa, arriving in Australia at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The oldest human remains found in Australia, at Lake Mungo in New South Wales, are approximately 42,000 years old. Aboriginal Australians and their ancestors survived the last ice age, which ended approximately 12,000 years ago and during which sea levels dropped significantly, connecting Australia to New Guinea and exposing vast areas of what is now continental shelf. They witnessed and survived the extinction of Australia's megafauna, including giant wombats, marsupial lions, and enormous birds. They developed one of the most sophisticated bodies of ecological knowledge in human history. None of this features prominently in the standard Australian school history curriculum. Number 23. The first fleet sailors raped Aboriginal women, and the colonial records acknowledge it. Among the documents produced by the First Fleet and the early years of the colony are accounts of sexual violence against Aboriginal women by convicts and soldiers. Governor Phillip was aware of the problem and issued orders against it that were largely unenforceable. The power imbalance between armed colonists and the communities they were encountering, the absence of any legal recourse for Aboriginal women, and the colonial attitude that Aboriginal people's suffering was not a serious legal matter, combined to create conditions in which sexual violence was endemic. The colonial records that acknowledge it do so in ways that minimize the gravity of what was happening, framing it as a conduct problem among the lower orders rather than as a systematic feature of colonial violence. The legacy of this violence is embedded in the genealogy of many Australian families and communities. Number 24. The Protection Acts controlled who Aboriginal people could marry. One of the most intimate controls of the Protection Acts was the power of the Protector to veto marriages. Aboriginal people could not legally marry without the written permission of the Protector in most jurisdictions under the various acts. This power was used to prevent marriages between Aboriginal people and white Australians in some contexts, and to enforce marriages in others. The underlying logic was explicitly eugenic. The goal was to manage the Aboriginal population in ways that would eventually cause it to disappear, either through the elimination of full-blooded Aboriginal people or through the deliberate mixing of lighter-skinned Aboriginal people with white Australians in order to produce subsequent generations who would be classified as white. This policy was articulated explicitly by figures like A.O. Neville, the Chief Protector of Western Australia, who wrote about the eventual biological absorption of the Aboriginal population into the white population as a desirable policy goal. Number 25, A.O. Neville and the policy of biological absorption. Ober Octavius Neville served as Chief Protector of Aborigines in Western Australia from 1915 to 1940. He is one of the most significant architects of the Stolen Generations policy, and his public statements about the goal of that policy are among the most explicit articulations of government-sanctioned eugenics in Australian history. Neville argued publicly, in speeches and writings, that the goal of Aboriginal policy should be the eventual elimination of the Aboriginal race through the progressive mixing of lighter-skinned Aboriginal people with white Australians. He was not a fringe figure. He was a senior public servant with broad administrative authority over the lives of Aboriginal people in Australia's largest state. His policies were endorsed by successive Western Australian governments. He is the real-life model for the character of Mr. Neville in the film Rabbit-Proof Fence, which depicted the removal of Aboriginal children from their families and their attempt to walk home across the Australian desert. Number 26. The Rabbit-Proof Fence story is true, and the government knew it was happening. The story told in the film Rabbit-Proof Fence, based on the book by Doris Pilkington Garamara, is true. Molly Craig and her sisters Daisy and Gracie were taken from their home in Jigalong in 1931 at the ages of 14, 10 and 8 respectively, and placed at the Moore River Native Settlement. Molly led her sisters in an escape and walked approximately 2,400 kilometres along the Rabbit-Proof Fence back to their home. They were recaptured. Molly escaped again with her youngest daughter in 1941 and walked back to Jigalong again. This story is not exceptional in the history of the stolen generations. Children were removed, they escaped, they were recaptured, families were separated for years or permanently. The government was not simply implementing misguided welfare policy. It was implementing a policy that government officials at the highest levels described in terms of racial elimination. Number 27. The Appin Massacre of 1816 on April 17, 1816. Poor soldiers under the command of Captain James Wallace attacked a camp of Darawal Aboriginal people near the Cataract River south of Sydney. At least 14 people were killed, including women and children. 2 of the bodies were hanged from a tree as a warning. Governor Lachlan Macquarie had authorised the expedition and ordered that captured men be killed and women and children taken prisoner. The expedition was one of several punitive operations Macquarie authorised against Aboriginal people south of Sydney in response to raids on settler property. Macquarie is remembered in Australian history as an enlightened and progressive governor, a man of the Enlightenment who improved the conditions of convicts and invested in public buildings. The Appin Massacre, which he ordered, is not typically included in the standard account of his character. Number 28. The Pinjarra Massacre of 1834. On October 28, 1834, Governor James Stirling of the Swan River Colony in Western Australia led a force of soldiers and settlers against a group of Binjareb Noongar people near Pinjarra, south of Perth. The number of Aboriginal people killed has been disputed, but estimates range from 15 to over 80. Stirling reported it as a battle. Subsequent historical analysis has characterised it as a massacre of a group that included women and children. Stirling was celebrated in Western Australian history as the colony's founder for most of the following century. Pinjarra is a prosperous town today. A memorial to the massacre was eventually established, but debate about the event and how to commemorate it has continued. The town's name itself comes from a Noongar word, a daily reminder of the people whose land was taken and whose deaths were officially treated as a battle rather than a massacre. The experience of Pinjarra reflects a broader pattern in Australian local history. Places with massacre histories contain communities that have managed their relationship with that history unevenly, with some embracing full acknowledgement and others still resistant to it. Number 29, the Cape Grim Massacre of 1828 on February 10th, 1828. Sealers employed by the Van Diemen's Land Company shot and killed between 30 and 100 Pirapa Aboriginal people at Cape Grim on the northwestern tip of what is now Tasmania. The sealers had a grievance. Aboriginal people had killed some of their sheep. The response was a massacre that pushed the bodies off the cliff above the sea. An inquiry was conducted. No one was charged with any crime. The Cape Grim Massacre was one of many incidents in the Black War, the deadliest conflict in Tasmanian history that ended with the near-total destruction of the Aboriginal population of the island, the conflict between British colonists and the Aboriginal people of Van Diemen's Land that effectively destroyed the Aboriginal population of that island within a few generations of European arrival. It is also the site where Australia's oldest continuous atmospheric monitoring station has operated since 1976, measuring the cleanest air in the world at a place where one of the most devastating massacres in Tasmanian history occurred. Number 30, the Black Line of 1830. In October and November of 1830, Lieutenant Governor George Arthur organised what he called the Black Line, a human chain of more than 2,000 soldiers, settlers and convicts stretched across the Tasmanian peninsula, attempting to drive the remaining Aboriginal Tasmanians southward into a corner where they could be captured. It was one of the largest military operations in Australian colonial history. It cost an enormous sum of money, and it caught 2 Aboriginal people, an old man and a young boy. The operation was a practical failure, but the strategy of which it was a part was not. By the time of the Black Line, the Aboriginal population of Tasmania had been reduced from perhaps several thousand at European contact to a few hundred. The combination of massacre, disease, dispossession, and the capture and removal of Aboriginal people to Flinders Island effectively eliminated the Aboriginal population of mainland Tasmania within 50 years of colonisation. Number 31. Truganini was not the last Tasmanian Aboriginal person. One of the most durable myths in Australian history is that Truganini, who died in 1876, was the last Aboriginal Tasmanian. This was the narrative promoted by the colonial establishment, which found in the idea of the last survivor a convenient way of suggesting that the Aboriginal Tasmanians had simply died out, and as if they had become extinct like an animal species through some natural process rather than being killed and driven off their land through deliberate violence and policy. In fact, a significant Aboriginal community survived on Flinders Island and subsequently in the Furneaux Group, including many people of partial Tasmanian Aboriginal descent. Their descendants, who number in the thousands today, have fought for recognition of their identity against an official narrative that declared their ancestors extinct. The myth of the last Tasmanian Aboriginal person was not simply historically incorrect. It was politically useful for a colonial society that found it much easier to claim that the Aboriginal Tasmanians had naturally died out than to acknowledge that they had been systematically killed. Number 32. The bombing of the Japanese at Darwin and the cover-up. On February 19th, 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked Darwin in what was the largest foreign military attack ever made on Australian soil. 246 people were killed in the raid. 8 ships were sunk. The town was left in chaos. The federal government's initial response was to minimize the scale of the attack, initially reporting casualties as far lower than they actually were and restricting media coverage of the damage. Prime Minister John Curtin's government was concerned about the impact on civilian morale. The official death toll was not accurately reported for years. Military personnel who fled Darwin during and after the raids, in circumstances later described as a panic, were initially threatened with prosecution, but the matter was handled quietly. The full story of what happened at Darwin on that day, including the scale of the military and civilian response, was not publicly acknowledged for decades. Number 33. The government abandoned civilians in Darwin and the Northern Territory in 1942. The fall of Singapore in February 1942, combined with the Darwin raids, created genuine fear that Japan might invade northern Australia. The government's contingency planning included a strategy sometimes referred to as the Brisbane Line, a proposed defensive line roughly following the Tropic of Capricorn, north of which the military would not attempt to hold ground. Under this strategy, the northern third of Australia, including Darwin and the Northern Territory, would be abandoned to a potential Japanese advance. The Brisbane Line was never formally adopted as policy, and its existence has been disputed, but military planning documents from the period make clear that the defence of the North was not a priority, and that significant parts of northern Australia were effectively left undefended. Civilians in Darwin and other northern communities experienced the chaos of the Japanese raids with minimal warning and inadequate government support in the immediate aftermath. Number 34. The internment of Australians of Italian and German descent. During the Second World War, the Australian government interned thousands of Australians of Italian and German descent, many of whom had lived in Australia for decades and had no connection to or sympathy with the Axis powers. Between 1940 and 1945, approximately 7,000 people were interned under the National Security Act. They included naturalised citizens, Australian-born children of migrants, and in some cases men who had actually been persecuted in Italy or Germany and had fled to Australia specifically to escape fascism. The internment was based primarily on ethnicity, rather than evidence of disloyalty. Communities across Australia, particularly in Queensland and South Australia, where significant Italian agricultural communities had developed, were devastated. Families lost their businesses and properties while breadwinners were imprisoned. The compensation offered after the war was minimal. The policy has received relatively little public attention compared with the treatment of Japanese Americans in the United States, though it was comparable in its injustice. Number 35. Aboriginal Australians served in both world wars without equal recognition. Aboriginal Australians served in both world wars, often enlisting under false names or by passing as non-Aboriginal, to get around the official policy discouraging or prohibiting their recruitment. In the First World War, Aboriginal men served at Gallipoli, the Western Front, and in other theatres. They returned home to find that the soldier settlement schemes, which gave land to returning white veterans, were not available to them. They returned to the restrictions of the Protection Acts, to the discrimination of the broader society, and in many cases to worse conditions than before the war, because their absence had disrupted the communities and families they had left behind. Their service was used selectively by government propaganda, but their entitlements were not honoured equally. The same pattern repeated after the Second World War. Number 36. The Pine Gap Facility and what it actually does. Pine Gap, formerly known as the Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap, is a US-Australian intelligence facility, located about 18 kilometres southwest of Alice Springs. It has been operating since 1970. The official public account of Pine Gap's functions has consistently understated what the facility actually does. Research and documentation by journalists and academics, including work by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and researchers like Richard Tanter, has established that Pine Gap is a major satellite ground station for the US National Security Agency and National Reconnaissance Office, that it plays a significant role in the collection of signals intelligence across Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere, and that it has been involved in the targeting of drone strikes and other lethal military operations. The Australian government has acknowledged Pine Gap's existence and general intelligence function for decades, but has consistently declined to discuss its specific capabilities or operations. Australians living in what is nominally a sovereign country have almost no democratic oversight or public information about a facility on Australian soil that contributes directly to military operations being conducted by the United States. Number 37. The ISIS spying scandal in East Timor during negotiations between Australia and the newly independent nation of East Timor over the maritime boundary and the exploitation of oil and gas resources in the Timor Sea, Australia's Secret Intelligence Service, ASIS, planted listening devices in the offices used by the Timorese government's negotiating team during treaty discussions in Dili. This was discovered and became a major diplomatic scandal in 2013, when Witness K, a former ASIS officer, and his lawyer Bernard Collaery began to expose the operation. Rather than fully acknowledging what had happened, the Australian government prosecuted both Witness K and Collaery under national security laws. The prosecutions took years, consumed enormous legal resources, and were widely condemned by legal scholars, former intelligence officials, and international observers as an attempt to suppress information about Australian government misconduct, rather than to protect genuine national security. The case illustrated a pattern in Australian government behaviour. When embarrassing misconduct is exposed, the instinct is to prosecute the exposer rather than acknowledge the wrong. Number 38. East Timor and Australia's role in the invasion that killed 200,000 people. When Indonesia invaded East Timor in December 1975, it did so with the tacit approval of the Australian government under Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, who later said that he had expressed his personal view that an independent East Timor was not viable. Thought a statement that Indonesian officials took as permission to proceed under Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, who had met with Indonesian President Suharto weeks before the invasion, and signalled that Australia would not object. The United States also gave Indonesia a green light. What followed was an occupation that killed approximately 180,000 people, somewhere between a quarter and a third of East Timor's pre-invasion population, through direct violence, famine, and disease. Australia recognised Indonesian sovereignty over East Timor in 1979, making it one of the only countries in the world to formally recognise the annexation. This recognition facilitated the Timor Gap Treaty, signed in 1989 between Australia and Indonesia, which divided the resources of the Timor Sea between the two countries, while East Timor was still under occupation. The resources of the Timor Sea were claimed and exploited by Australia for decades on the basis of a treaty with the country that was illegally occupying East Timor. Number 39. The Stolen Generations Legacy in current incarceration rates. Australia has some of the highest Indigenous incarceration rates of any country on Earth. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people represent approximately 3% of the Australian population, but approximately 30% of the adult prison population. Indigenous women are the fastest growing prison population in Australia. Children are being removed from Aboriginal families today at rates that researchers and advocates have described as a new stolen generation, with the removal rates in some jurisdictions exceeding those of the historical removal policy in some years. The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which reported in 1991, found that the over-incarceration of Aboriginal Australians was connected to the broader history of colonisation, dispossession, and the removal of children from families. Its recommendations were largely not implemented. Aboriginal people continue to die in custody in Australia at rates that, if they were occurring in any other context, would be the subject of international outrage. Number 40. The Christmas Island Detention Centre. And what happens there? Australia operates offshore detention facilities on Christmas Island and in Papua New Guinea and Nauru under a policy framework called offshore processing, are designed to prevent asylum seekers arriving by boat from accessing Australia's refugee protection system. The conditions in these facilities have been documented by medical professionals, human rights organisations, and journalists, and they are, by any reasonable assessment, inhumane. Children have been held in these facilities for months or years. Adults have developed serious mental health conditions, including PTSD and depression, as a direct consequence of indefinite detention. Self-harm and suicide attempts have been documented at high rates. Medical professionals who worked in the facilities and spoke publicly about conditions faced prosecution under secrecy provisions in the Australian Border Force Act, until a court found those provisions unenforceable. The Australian government has consistently defended these policies as necessary for deterrence. Number 41. Australia signed the Refugee Convention and then built offshore prisons. Australia is a signatory to the 1951 United Nations Refugee Convention, which obliges signatories to provide protection to people fleeing persecution. The offshore processing policy, implemented in various forms since the early 2000s, is designed specifically to prevent asylum seekers from reaching Australian territory where they could access the Convention's protections. The policy has been challenged in Australian courts and in the High Court, which has found various aspects of it constitutionally problematic. Legal scholars and human rights organisations have argued that the policy violates Australia's obligations under international law. The Australian government's position has been that processing asylum claims offshore, in facilities on foreign territory that Australia controls and funds, does not engage its convention obligations. This position has not been accepted by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, or by most international legal opinion. Australia built offshore detention facilities, specifically to avoid the legal obligations it had voluntarily undertaken. Number 42. The Children Overboard Affair. In October 2001, in the weeks before a federal election, members of the Howard government claimed that asylum seekers on a vessel called the SIEVX had thrown their children overboard into the ocean in order to force the Navy to rescue them, thereby gaining entry into Australia. The story was used to depict asylum seekers as unworthy of protection and to justify the government's hardline border policy. The story was false. The Senate Select Committee that investigated the affair found that the government had been advised that no children had been thrown overboard, but had continued to make the claim publicly. 263 people, including 146 children, drowned when the CVEX sank on October 19, 2001. The Children Overboard Affair remains one of the clearest documented cases of deliberate government misinformation in Australian history. Number 43. The Stolen Land and the Terra Nullius Fiction. The doctrine of terra nullius, which held that Australia was legally unoccupied at the time of British colonisation, was not formally overturned in Australian law until the High Court's decision in Mabo v Queensland in 1992. The Mabo decision, delivered on June 3, 1992, recognised that Eddie Mabo and the Meriam people of the Murray Islands had maintained continuous connection to and rights over their traditional lands, and that the common law of Australia did recognise native title in circumstances where that connection had been maintained. The decision overturned the legal fiction of terra nullius that had underpinned 200 years of colonial land acquisition. It did not return any land that had already been converted to freehold title. It did not resolve the question of what compensation was owed to Aboriginal people for 2 centuries of dispossession. It was, despite its historic significance, a limited legal remedy for an enormous historical wrong. Number 44. The Native Title Act and the Backlash. The Keating government's Native Title Act of 1993, passed in response to the Mabo decision, was the legislative framework for recognising and processing native title claims. The pastoral industry and state governments mounted fierce resistance to it. The Wick decision of 1996, in which the High Court found that native title could coexist with pastoral leases on some conditions, produced another wave of political backlash. The Howard government's native title amendments of 1998, known as the 10-Point Plan, significantly wound back the rights that had been established by the courts, and were condemned by Aboriginal leaders, legal scholars, and the United Nations as a regression. The native title system that exists today is extraordinarily slow, expensive, and limited in what it can achieve. The vast majority of Australia has been extinguished from native title claims by historical land grants. Number 45. The NT Intervention and its Legacy. In 2007, the Howard government announced the Northern Territory Emergency Response, commonly called the Intervention, in response to the Little Children Are Sacred report, which documented child sexual abuse in Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory. The response was announced without consultation with Aboriginal communities and included the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act to allow measures that would not otherwise have been legally permissible. The intervention included the compulsory acquisition of Aboriginal land, the quarantining of welfare payments, the deployment of military and government personnel into communities, and restrictions on the purchase of alcohol. The stated purpose was child protection. Critics argued that the measures were disproportionate, that the evidence base for many of them was inadequate, and that the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act was an extraordinary step that signaled the government's awareness that its actions could not withstand a racial discrimination challenge. Evaluations of the intervention's outcomes have been mixed at best. Number 46. Australia's treatment of asylum seekers has been condemned by the UN, the United Nations Human Rights Committee, the United Nations Torture Committee, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and multiple other international human rights bodies, have found that Australia's treatment of asylum seekers in its offshore detention facilities breaches Australia's obligations under international human rights law. These findings have included conclusions that Australia's treatment of asylum seekers constitutes arbitrary detention, that conditions in facilities breach the prohibition on cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, and that the harm caused to children in detention breaches the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Australia has consistently disputed or failed to implement the remedies recommended by these bodies. A country that lectures others about human rights and the rule of law has been repeatedly found by the international community's human rights mechanisms to be in breach of its own commitments. Number 47. The Dismissal and the CIA. On November 11, 1975, the Whitlam government was dismissed by Governor-General John Kerr. What is less well known is the documented evidence that American intelligence agencies, including the CIA, were extremely concerned about the Whitlam government's foreign policy and its threatened closure of Pine Gap. Christopher Boyce, an American intelligence operative convicted of selling secrets to the Soviets, stated publicly that the CIA had referred to Kerr as their man in Canberra. Former CIA officer Victor Marchetti made similar claims. Whitlam himself believed that the CIA was involved in the dismissal. A senior CIA official, Theodore Shackley, was involved in communications with Australian intelligence contacts during this period. The full extent of any American involvement in the dismissal has never been established through a public inquiry, partly because no such inquiry has ever been held. The question has been treated by the Australian political establishment as a conspiracy theory, despite the documented evidence of CIA interest and involvement with Australian intelligence at the time. Number 48. The Port Arthur Massacre and the gun laws that followed. On April 28th and 29th, 1996, Martin Bryant killed 35 people and wounded 23 others at Port Arthur in Tasmania, in the worst mass shooting in Australian history. The government of Prime Minister John Howard introduced the National Firearms Agreement within 12 days of the massacre. The agreement established uniform gun licensing and registration requirements across all states and territories, banned semi-automatic and pump-action rifles and shotguns, and organized a national buyback of weapons, eventually collecting and destroying approximately 650,000 firearms. The Howard government's swift action on gun control in the face of the Port Arthur massacre is one of the most cited examples of decisive gun legislation anywhere in the world. What is less often noted is that the legislation was only possible because of the specific federal structure of Australia's constitutional arrangements. The speed of the legislation, 12 days from massacre to national agreement, reflects the degree to which the political will existed when it was mobilised. The question of why that will existed for gun control in a way it has never existed for the protection of Aboriginal lives raises questions about whose deaths motivate Australian political action. Number 49. Australia's treatment of Indonesia and the Balibo Five. In October 1975, 5 journalists working for Australian television networks were killed at Balibo in East Timor as they attempted to cover the Indonesian military's covert operations ahead of the formal invasion. The Australian government's response was inadequate. The deaths were initially characterised by both the Australian and Indonesian governments as the result of crossfire, a characterisation that subsequent investigations have found to be false. A coroner's inquest in New South Wales in 2007 found that the journalists had been deliberately killed by Indonesian troops and that the killings could constitute war crimes under Australian law. The Australian government had information about the circumstances of the deaths that it withheld for years. The journalists became known as the Balibo Five, and their story was the subject of a feature film. Australian governments of both parties chose strategic and economic interests with Indonesia over justice for the families of their own citizens. Number 50. The Maralinga nuclear tests and what they did to Anangu people between 1955 and 1963. Britain conducted 12 major nuclear weapons tests at Maralinga in South Australia, with Australian government approval. The area was the traditional land of the Anangu people, some of whom were still living in the region when the tests began. The government conducted what it described as a surveillance program to move Aboriginal people away from the test sites. But the surveillance was inadequate, the land was vast, and the consequences for those who were not moved were severe and long-lasting. But the program was inadequate. The terrain was vast and people were missed. Aboriginal people were exposed to radiation without their knowledge or consent. The long-term health effects included elevated rates of cancer and other radiation-related illness. The contamination of the Maralinga site required a major remediation effort in the 1990s that cost hundreds of millions of dollars and was not fully successful. Britain paid compensation to the Australian government for some of the costs. But the Aboriginal people most directly affected by the tests received no direct compensation from the British government for decades. The land was formally returned to the Anangu people in 2009, number 51. The systematic exclusion of women from public life for most of Australian history. Australia gave women the right to vote in federal elections in 1902, making it one of the first countries in the world to do so. This achievement is frequently cited in Australian national mythology as evidence of progressive values. What is less frequently noted is that female suffrage coexisted with pervasive legal and structural discrimination against women in virtually every other domain of public life. Women were barred from most professions. Married women were required to resign from the public service until the 1960s. Women faced discrimination in hiring, in wages, and in access to credit and financial services. The first woman elected to the Australian Federal Parliament, Enid Lyons, was not elected until 1943. The first female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, did not take office until 2010, and the misogyny she experienced during her tenure was extensive, public, and largely tolerated by the political and media establishment. Number 52, Julia Gillard and the misogyny speech. In October 2012, Prime Minister Julia Gillard delivered a speech in the House of Representatives responding to the then opposition leader Tony Abbott's motion to remove the Speaker. The speech, which catalogued the misogyny she had experienced from Abbott and from the broader political culture, became internationally famous and is one of the most watched parliamentary speeches in Australian history. What the speech and its reception revealed about Australia was not flattering. Gillard had been subjected to years of public commentary about her body, her relationship, her childlessness, and her appearance from politicians, shock jocks, and commentators in ways that her male predecessors had never experienced. The misogyny she described in her speech was not a secret to anyone who had been paying attention. It was normalized. The speech was famous internationally as an act of political courage. In Australia, it was immediately contested by sections of the political and media establishment that argued Gillard was playing the gender card. Number 53, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, which ran from 2013 to 2017, examined the systematic sexual abuse of children in Australian institutions, including the Catholic Church, Anglican Church, Scouts, sports organisations, and state care facilities. It heard evidence from over 15,000 survivors and examined over 4,000 individual cases of alleged abuse. The final report found that the abuse had been widespread, that institutions had consistently prioritized their own reputation over the welfare of children, and that the failure of institutions to respond appropriately had caused enormous harm to victims. The Catholic Church in particular was found to have moved abusive clergy from parish to parish rather than reporting them to police or removing them from ministry. Cardinal George Pell, the most senior Catholic in Australia and one of the most senior in the world, was convicted of child sexual abuse in 2018, though that conviction was subsequently overturned by the High Court on the grounds that the jury's verdict was unreasonable. Number 54, the state care system that abused the children. It was supposed to protect the Royal Commission, found that abuse of children in state care, in institutions run by state governments, was systematic and extended over decades. That children who had been removed from their families by the state and placed in government-run or government-funded institutions experienced physical, sexual, and emotional abuse that the institutions failed to prevent or address, and in many cases actively concealed. The same pattern that had applied to Aboriginal children under the Stolen Generations policy applied to non-Aboriginal children in state care: removal from family on grounds of protection, placement in institutions where they experience further harm, and the consistent prioritization of institutional reputation over individual welfare. The survivors of abuse in state care have fought for decades for compensation and acknowledgement that frequently came too slowly and too inadequately to provide genuine redress. Number 55. Australia's record on climate change. Australia is one of the world's largest per capita emitters of greenhouse gases. Its per capita emissions are among the highest in the OECD, and its emissions intensity in electricity generation has been among the highest in the developed world for decades. It is among the world's largest exporters of coal and natural gas. The Australian government and major political parties have had a relationship with the fossil fuel industry that critics have described as captured, with significant political donations flowing from fossil fuel companies to both major parties and with senior politicians moving between government and the fossil fuel industry in ways that raise serious questions about conflicts of interest. Australia's failure to achieve meaningful climate policy for 2 decades across multiple governments of both parties, during which the science of climate change became increasingly clear and the impacts increasingly visible in Australia's own environment through more intense bushfires, coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef, and more extreme weather events, is one of the most significant failures of Australian governance in the modern era. Number 56, the 2019-20 bushfire season. Between September 2019 and March 2020, bushfires burned approximately 18 million hectares across southeastern Australia, killing 33 people directly, an estimated 3 billion animals, and causing widespread and long-lasting damage to ecosystems across New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland, and Western Australia. The fires were the worst in recorded Australian history. Prime Minister Scott Morrison was on holiday in Hawaii as the fires burned. He returned under public pressure, but his handling of the crisis was widely criticised as inadequate. A royal commission into the fires made recommendations about climate change and emergency management. The government accepted many of the recommendations on emergency management, but did not commit to the emissions reduction targets that many scientists and public health experts argued were necessary to reduce the risk of future catastrophic fire seasons. Number 57, the Sports Rorts Affair. In 2019, the Australian National Audit Office found that the Community Sports Infrastructure Grants Program, administered by then Sports Minister Bridget McKenzie, had been used to direct funding to marginal seats held by or targeted by the Liberal National Coalition, with a substantial bias toward government-held and target electorates rather than the merit-based criteria the program was supposed to use. An analysis found that over 70% of the funding went to seats held by or targeted by the coalition, versus around 20% to Labor seats, despite the fact that the merit-based assessments prepared by Sport Australia showed a very different distribution. McKenzie resigned, citing a conflict of interest in a different aspect of the grants, not specifically because of the rorting. The use of community grants as a political tool, directing public money to marginal electorates before elections, is a pattern so common in Australian politics that it has its own name. The sports rorts affair was notable primarily because it was documented in detail by the Auditor General. The use of public grant money as an electoral tool is so embedded in Australian political practice that the affair produced more embarrassment than genuine institutional reform. Number 58, the robo-debt scheme and its victims. Between 2016 and 2019, the Australian government's Department of Human Services issued approximately 470,000 automated debt notices to welfare recipients, claiming they owed money to the government based on a flawed algorithmic assessment of their income against tax office records. The scheme used an automated income averaging process that was not legally valid and produced debts that were in many cases incorrect. People who received these notices, many of them already in financial difficulty, were required to prove they did not owe money rather than having the government prove that they did. The stress of receiving these debt notices contributed to the suicides of some welfare recipients. The scheme was eventually found by a federal court to have been unlawful. The government settled a class action for $1.8 billion. A royal commission found that senior public servants and ministers had been warned of the scheme's problems and had proceeded regardless, and that deliberate concealment of information had occurred. The Royal Commission referred findings to the National Anti-Corruption Commission, number 59, the Banking Royal Commission, and what the banks had been doing. The Royal Commission into Misconduct in the Banking, Superannuation and Financial Services Industry, which reported in 2019, documented systematic misconduct across Australia's major banks and financial institutions. The misconduct included charging fees to customers who were dead, giving financial advice that was in the interests of advisors rather than clients, charging fees for services that were never provided, and predatory lending to people who could not repay the loans. The report found that the misconduct was not isolated to a few bad actors, but was systemic, driven by a culture that prioritized profit over customer welfare. The major banks had lobbied the government for years to resist calls for a royal commission. When the commission was finally held and documented the extent of the misconduct, it was clear that the banks had known that a commission would find exactly what it found. The government eventually followed through on some of the commission's recommendations, but not all. Number 60. The casualisation of the Australian workforce and its consequences. Australia has one of the highest rates of casual employment among developed countries. Casual workers receive no paid leave, no sick leave, and no protection against unfair dismissal. The growth of casual and gig economy work over the past 3 decades has transferred financial risk from employers to workers, reduced workers' ability to make long-term financial plans, and made housing affordability worse by reducing the income security that banks require for mortgage lending. The Fair Work Commission has made some progress in addressing the worst features of casualisation, but the structural shift toward insecure work has been a consistent policy direction of successive governments of both parties, under pressure from employer groups and the Business Council of Australia. Number 61. The housing affordability crisis and how government policy created it. Australia has some of the least affordable housing of any developed country in the world. Sydney and Melbourne consistently rank among the top 10 least affordable cities on Earth by various housing affordability measures. The housing affordability crisis is not an accident. It is the predictable result of specific government policy choices, including negative gearing tax concessions that give investors tax advantages for owning investment properties, to capital gains tax discounts that reduce the effective tax rate on property investment, and the consistent prioritization of existing property owners' interests over first home buyers and renters. Both major parties have been reluctant to reform these policy settings because a large proportion of their voter base are property owners who benefit from rising prices. Number 62. The media concentration problem. Australia has one of the most concentrated media ownership structures in the democratic world. News Corp, controlled by Rupert Murdoch and the Murdoch family, owns a majority of the capital city and national daily newspapers in Australia. The influence of News Corp on Australian politics has been documented extensively by media researchers, former politicians, and public interest advocates. The campaign against the carbon tax under the Gillard and Rudd governments, against the National Broadband Network, and against various Labour Party initiatives was conducted in News Corp publications with an intensity that critics argued crossed the line from journalism into political advocacy. The Australian Communications and Media Authority, the industry regulator, has limited powers to address media concentration. Multiple inquiries have recommended strengthening media ownership regulation. No government has done so. Number 63. The Reinhardt Forest Wealth and the Iron Ore Royalties. They did not pay. Gina Reinhardt is Australia's wealthiest person, and one of the wealthiest people on Earth, with a fortune built substantially on iron ore royalties from the Pilbara region of Western Australia. Her father, Lang Hancock, negotiated exploration agreements with the Western Australian government in the 1960s that were extraordinarily favourable to private interests, including a royalty rate that critics have described as among the lowest in the world for comparable mineral resources. The royalties paid to the state government by the major iron ore companies for the extraordinary mineral wealth extracted from Western Australian land have been the subject of ongoing political debate. The traditional owners of the Pilbara, the Yindjibarndi and other peoples, received for many years virtually no benefit from the extraction of mineral wealth from their traditional country. A legal settlement between Fortescue Metals and the Yindjibarndi people took over a decade of litigation, during which the company's approach to the traditional owners was extensively criticised by the federal court. Number 64. The Juukan Gorge destruction in May 2020, Rio Tinto, one of the world's largest mining companies, blew up the Juukan Gorge rock shelters in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. The shelters were among the oldest known evidence of continuous human occupation in Australia, containing artefacts including a piece of plaited hairgrass that had been radiocarbon dated to 22,000 years old, spanning the last ice age. The destruction was legally authorised under a provision of the Western Australian Aboriginal Heritage Act that allowed mining companies to seek ministerial approval to destroy heritage sites. Rio Tinto had received approval in 2013. The Putukunti Kurama and Pinikura traditional owners had objected and asked Rio Tinto to reconsider. Rio Tinto proceeded. The destruction generated international outrage and led to the resignation of Rio Tinto's chief executive and two other senior executives. It also led to the reform of the Western Australian Aboriginal Heritage Act, which had allowed this to happen in the first place. Number 65. The Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Laws that allowed Juukan to happen. The Western Australian Aboriginal Heritage Act, under which Juukan Gorge was destroyed, dated from 1972. It gave the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs the power to grant approval for the destruction of Aboriginal heritage sites on the recommendation of a council, and this ministerial approval process had been used extensively by the mining industry to legally authorise the destruction of heritage sites across Western Australia. A review commissioned after Juukan found that the Act was fundamentally inadequate for protecting Aboriginal cultural heritage because it prioritised development and economic interests over heritage protection, because the assessment process was opaque and weighted toward mining interests, and because Aboriginal traditional owners had insufficient power to prevent destruction even when they clearly objected. A new Act was passed in 2021, but its implementation has been contested. Number 66. The Murray-Darling Basin Plan and the water theft. The Murray-Darling Basin is the agricultural heartland of Australia, a vast river system that provided water and sustenance to Aboriginal peoples for thousands of years before irrigation agriculture transformed it into one of the most contested water policy environments on Earth, that runs through Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and the Australian Capital Territory, and supports agricultural production worth billions of dollars annually. It is also one of the most stressed freshwater systems in the world. The Murray-Darling Basin Plan, adopted in 2012, was supposed to restore the environmental health of the river system by returning a significant volume of water to the environment while still allowing agriculture to continue at reduced intensity. The implementation of the plan has been marked by allegations of water theft, the use of political connections to obtain water licenses, the purchase of water at inflated prices from politically connected interests, the failure to enforce compliance with water rules, and the continued death of river reaches and the fish populations that depend on them. A Four Corners investigation in 2017 documented extensive alleged water theft in the Northern Basin. A subsequent review found significant problems with the plan's implementation and governance. Number 67. The Great Barrier Reef and what is being allowed to happen to it. The Great Barrier Reef is the world's largest coral reef system, stretching approximately 2,300 kilometres along the coast of Queensland. It is not merely an environmental asset. It is the home of species found nowhere else on Earth and a critical part of the marine ecosystem of the Western Pacific. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the most biodiverse marine ecosystems on Earth, and a significant part of Australia's identity and tourism economy. The reef has experienced mass bleaching events in 2016, 2017, 2020, and 2022, driven primarily by rising ocean temperatures caused by climate change. The bleaching events have killed large portions of the reef. UNESCO has repeatedly threatened to place the Great Barrier Reef on the list of World Heritage in danger. And the Australian government has spent significant diplomatic energy lobbying against this classification, rather than committing to the emissions reduction policies that scientists say are necessary to protect the reef. Number 68, the sugar industry, pollution, and the reef. Beyond climate change, the Great Barrier Reef faces additional pressures from agricultural runoff, particularly from the sugarcane and cattle industries operating in the catchments that drain into the reef's waters. Nutrient and pesticide runoff promotes the growth of crown-of-thorn starfish, which consume coral and suppresses the coral's ability to recover from bleaching events. The Queensland and federal governments have been aware of this problem for decades. The political influence of the agricultural sector has consistently resulted in the prioritization of agricultural interests over environmental protection measures that could reduce runoff. The Reef 2050 Water Quality Improvement Plan and its predecessors have set targets for reducing runoff that have consistently not been met. The ongoing failure to meet water quality targets reflects the degree to which economic interests in the catchment areas continue to take precedence over the long-term health of the reef ecosystem. Number 69. The Adani coal mine and the groundwater. It will affect the Carmichael coal mine in Queensland. Owned by the Adani Group and later renamed the Bravas mine, has been one of the most controversial resource projects in recent Australian history. Proponents argued it would bring economic development and jobs to Queensland. Opponents argued that the extraction of billions of tons of coal and its export would contribute significantly to global greenhouse gas emissions, that the mine threatened critical underground water resources in the Galilee Basin, that the approval process had been inadequate, and that the mine's coal would ultimately be burned in a way that would contribute to the very climate change destroying the Great Barrier Reef offshore. Multiple legal challenges were launched. The mine eventually proceeded after years of controversy. The debate about it illustrated the structural difficulty Australia faces in transitioning away from coal extraction when state governments, major party donors, and sections of the media are heavily invested in continuation of the industry. Number 70. The Catholic Church's political influence on Australian social policy. The Catholic Church has exercised significant political influence on Australian social policy throughout the country's history. This influence has been felt most directly in areas of reproductive rights, including abortion and contraception, in education policy, where Catholic schools receive substantial public funding, in the debate about voluntary assisted dying, in policy on LGBTQ+ rights, and in the conduct of the Royal Commission into child sexual abuse in institutions. The Church's political lobbying has operated through formal channels and through the cultivation of political relationships, particularly with the Democratic Labour Party in the mid-20th century, and subsequently through individual relationships with politicians across the spectrum. The Church's protection of abusive clergy, documented extensively by the Royal Commission, was accompanied by political activity that sought to minimise external scrutiny and oversight. Number 71. The school funding debate and the private school subsidy. Australia funds private schools, including Catholic and other religious schools, through a combination of federal and state government subsidies. The formula used to determine the level of government funding has been the subject of bitter political debate for decades. Critics of the current system argue that elite private schools, many with multi-million-dollar facilities and extremely wealthy fee-paying communities, receive government funding that could more effectively be directed to disadvantaged public schools. Proponents of the current system argue that parents choosing private schooling are exercising a legitimate choice that should be supported. The political reality is that private school parents, including the parents of children at elite schools, form a significant and politically engaged constituency, and reforms that would significantly reduce government funding to private schools have consistently proved politically too costly for either major party to pursue. Number 72. The Medevac Bill and the government's reaction. In 2019, the Australian Parliament passed the Medevac Bill over the government's objection, like allowing medical professionals to make decisions about the transfer of seriously ill asylum seekers from offshore detention to Australia for medical treatment. The government argued that the bill would weaken border security. Medical professionals and human rights advocates argued that it was simply extending basic medical care to people in government custody. The government later repealed the legislation in the Senate after gaining control of the upper house through a deal with a crossbench senator. The episode illustrated the degree to which the government prioritized the politics of border control over the welfare of people in its care, even when those people were seriously ill children. Number 73. The wages theft problem in Australia's hospitality and agriculture sectors. Australia has experienced a wave of documented wage theft cases across the hospitality, agriculture, and retail sectors. The Fair Work Ombudsman has recovered hundreds of millions of dollars in underpaid wages since its establishment, a figure that represents only a fraction of the total underpayment occurring. Major corporations, including 7-Eleven, Woolworths, and various restaurant groups, have been found to have underpaid workers, in some cases by tens of millions of dollars in aggregate. Migrant workers on temporary visas have been particularly vulnerable because their visa status could be used by unscrupulous employers as leverage to prevent complaints. The extent of wage theft in Australia led to the criminalisation of deliberate wage theft, though prosecutions have been slow. The vulnerability of migrant workers has been a persistent feature of Australia's agricultural labour market, particularly for workers on the seasonal worker program. Number 74. The robo-debt suicides. The full human cost of the robo-debt scheme has never been precisely quantified, but the combination of financial stress, psychological harm, and the deaths that have been connected to receipt of debt notices makes it one of the most consequential policy failures in recent Australian history. But the Royal Commission into the scheme heard evidence that the receipt of automated debt notices contributed to the deaths of a number of welfare recipients, some of whom took their own lives in circumstances connected to the financial and psychological stress caused by the notices. The Commission's report found that the scheme had been implemented knowing it was legally problematic, and that warnings about its human impact had been ignored. The names of people who died have not been made fully public to protect their families. The bureaucrats and ministers responsible for the scheme were referred to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. But as of the writing of this script, no criminal prosecutions had resulted from a scheme the Royal Commission found had caused preventable deaths. Number 75. The dingo fence and what it did to the ecosystem. The dingo fence, also known as the dog fence, is the longest fence in the world, stretching approximately 5,614 kilometres across Queensland, New South Wales, and South Australia. It was built to prevent dingoes from entering the pastoral lands of southeastern Australia, where sheep are farmed. It has been successful in that purpose. The ecological consequences on the southern side of the fence, where dingoes have been eliminated, have been documented by researchers who have found that the absence of dingoes has contributed to the spread of kangaroo populations, the overgrazing associated with that expansion, and changes in the structure of vegetation communities. The removal of the top predator from a large and ecologically complex region produced consequences that the engineers of the fence did not anticipate, and that continue to reshape the ecosystem south of the fence today. Number 76. The extinction crisis and Australia's record. Australia has one of the worst records of animal extinctions of any country on Earth. More than 30 species of mammal have become extinct in Australia since European settlement, a rate that is disproportionately high by any international comparison. The causes include the introduction of invasive species, particularly cats and foxes, land clearing for agriculture and development, the disruption of indigenous fire management practices that had maintained habitat across the continent for thousands of years, and climate change. The Australian government's management of threatened species has been widely criticised as inadequate, with listing of species as threatened taking years, with recovery plans poorly funded and implemented, and with land clearing approvals continuing to destroy habitat for listed species. The political will to enforce existing environmental laws has been undermined by the economic interests of the industries responsible for the most significant threats to biodiversity. Number 77. The cats that eat 1 billion animals a year. Feral cats are the single biggest direct killer of Australian native wildlife. The difficulty of managing feral cat populations reflects the broader difficulty of Australian environmental policy. The solutions are known, the political will to implement them is insufficient, and the ecological damage continues. Research published in academic journals has estimated that feral cats kill approximately 1.5 billion native mammals, birds, and reptiles in Australia each year. Australia has the worst record of mammal extinctions in the world, and feral cats are a primary cause. The management of feral cat populations is politically contentious because domestic cats are beloved pets, and any culling program inevitably involves the killing of feral cats in ways that some members of the public find distressing, regardless of the ecological argument for doing so. The tension between the welfare of individual animals and the conservation of native species is one that Australian environmental policy has struggled to resolve effectively. Number 78. The loss of the thylacine and who is responsible. The thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger, was a unique carnivorous marsupial that existed in mainland Australia before being eliminated by dingoes, and which survived in Tasmania until the 20th century. The last known thylacine died in Hobart Zoo on September 7, 1936. It died from exposure after being locked out of its shelter on a cold night, an act of institutional negligence that killed what may have been the last of its species. The extinction of the thylacine is not solely attributable to this final negligence. The Tasmanian government offered bounties for thylacines for decades, treating them as pests that threaten livestock, and the population was hunted to near extinction before the zoo population died. The thylacine was given official protection in July 1936, less than 2 months before the last one died. The decision to protect it came after decades of bounty hunting had reduced the population to near zero, a pattern of protecting species after they are functionally extinct that has repeated itself in Australian conservation history. De-extinction projects using preserved genetic material are currently underway at the University of Melbourne. Number 79. Australia's treatment of West Papuan refugees. West Papua, the western half of the island of New Guinea, was transferred from Dutch to Indonesian administration in 1969 through a process called the Act of Free Choice, in which approximately 1,026 hand-picked Papuans were selected to vote on behalf of a population of approximately 800,000. The vote was unanimous for integration with Indonesia and was widely condemned as a sham. The subsequent Indonesian administration of West Papua has been characterized by human rights abuses, including arbitrary detention, torture, and killings of independence activists and community members. West Papuan refugees seeking asylum in Australia have been subject to the same offshore processing regime as other asylum seekers. Australia has been reluctant to criticize Indonesia's treatment of West Papuans because of the importance it places on the bilateral relationship with Indonesia. Number 80, the Indigenous Voice Referendum of 2023. In October 2023, Australia voted on a referendum to enshrine a constitutionally guaranteed voice to Parliament for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Australian Constitution. The referendum was defeated, with approximately 60% of Australians voting no. The campaign saw a significant information gap, with the no campaign emphasizing uncertainty and risk, while the yes campaign struggled to communicate the relatively modest nature of what was being proposed. The referendum result was a significant political setback for reconciliation advocates, and for the Albanese government that had championed the voice. Polling suggested that the defeat was driven significantly by voters in regional and rural areas, that a majority of non-Indigenous Australians voted no, and that the result reflected both genuine policy disagreement and the successful mobilization of fear and misinformation. The outcome did not reduce the substantive arguments for structural reform, but set back the political timeline for any constitutional change on Indigenous affairs significantly. Number 81. The failure to close the gap. The Closing the Gap framework was established in 2008 to measure and address the disparities in health, education, employment, and life expectancy between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians and non-Indigenous Australians. The disparities were dramatic: life expectancy gaps of over 10 years, vastly higher rates of infant mortality, dramatically lower educational outcomes, higher rates of incarceration, and multiple other measures showing acute disadvantage. Over 15 years after the Closing the Gap framework was established, most of the original targets had not been met, and some measures had worsened. The failures are not simply technical policy failures. They reflect the inadequacy of the resources devoted to the task, the ongoing structural racism in Australian institutions, the distance between policy made in Canberra and the reality of communities in remote Australia, and the failure to implement the community-led, self-determining approaches that evidence suggests are most effective. Number 82. The deaths in custody that keep happening. The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which reported in 1991, examined 99 deaths and made 339 recommendations. The irony of 99 items in this video matching the 99 deaths examined by that commission is not intentional, but is not unwelcome. 30 years later, more than 500 Aboriginal people had died in custody since the Commission reported. The implementation of the Commission's recommendations had been inconsistent and incomplete. The specific failings identified by the Commission: inadequate supervision, failure to respond to people in medical distress, inadequate management of people with mental health conditions, and systemic racism in the justice system, continued to be documented in subsequent deaths. Each individual death has been the subject of colonial inquests, many of which have reached findings of failure to provide adequate care. The systemic change that the Commission recommended has not occurred. Number 83. The welfare card and its critics. The cashless debit card, later renamed the Basics card in different iterations, was applied to communities without the kind of rigorous evidence base that would normally justify a major social policy intervention, and continued to be expanded despite evaluations showing limited evidence of effectiveness, was a mechanism for controlling the welfare payments of people in designated areas, requiring that a portion or all of their welfare payments be spent through a card that prevented purchases of alcohol and gambling. The program was applied primarily in areas with high Aboriginal populations, and was the subject of significant criticism from community leaders, welfare advocates, and many of the people subject to it, who argued that it was paternalistic, ineffective as a tool for reducing the harms it was supposed to address, and stigmatizing to welfare recipients generally. An evaluation commissioned by the government found limited evidence that the card reduced alcohol-related harm. Successive governments extended and expanded the program over the objections of community leaders. The Albanese government eventually dismantled the cashless debit card after coming to office in 2022. Number 84. The AATSIS Collection and the Cultural Property Australia holds the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, holds one of the largest collections of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural material in the world, including film, photographs, audio recordings, documents, and other materials. Significant portions of this collection were taken from communities without their free and informed consent. Those during the period of the Protection Acts, when Aboriginal people had no legal recourse against the removal of their cultural property. The repatriation of cultural materials to their communities of origin is an ongoing process. Materials that hold enormous cultural and ceremonial significance to specific communities are sometimes held in the collections of universities, museums, and government institutions in ways that limit community access. The question of who owns the cultural heritage of Aboriginal Australia is one that Australian institutions have been grappling with, unevenly and imperfectly, for decades. Number 85. The treaty that was never made. Australia is one of the only countries that colonised Indigenous peoples without making a treaty with them. The ongoing absence of a treaty framework is not simply a historical matter. It continues to define the terms on which Aboriginal rights are recognised, negotiated, and withheld in the 21st century. New Zealand has the Treaty of Waitangi. Canada has its treaty framework, however imperfectly honoured. The United States has its treaties, however frequently violated. Australia has nothing. There was never a foundational agreement, a negotiation of terms, a formal recognition that the Aboriginal people of Australia had rights that needed to be acknowledged before the colony could proceed on legitimate terms. The question of whether Australia should negotiate a treaty or treaties with Aboriginal peoples is one that has been raised periodically throughout Australian history. Various states have begun treaty processes, with Victoria most advanced. The federal government has never committed to a national treaty process. The absence of a treaty is not simply a historical curiosity. It continues to define the legal and political framework within which Aboriginal rights are or are not recognised. Number 86. The convict system and its long shadow. Australia's founding as a convict colony has left a cultural legacy that is complex and contested. The cultural embrace of larrikinism and anti-authority sentiment, often attributed to the convict heritage, coexists uneasily with a deeply authoritarian streak in Australian governance that dates from the same period. The convicts who were transported were predominantly from the poorest strata of British society, convicted of offences that in many cases would today be considered minor crimes or no crime at all. They were transported to the other side of the world as a cost-effective way of dealing with a population the British state considered surplus and dangerous. In Australia, the convict past was for much of Australian history a source of shame rather than pride, something to be concealed rather than acknowledged. The cultural shift toward a more positive interpretation of the convict heritage, the idea of convict ancestry as a marker of Australian irreverence and resistance to authority, occurred gradually over the 20th century. But the deeper structural legacy of the convict system, the establishment of a colonial society built on forced labour, the hierarchies of power that it created, the relationship between the state and the individual that it normalised, runs through Australian history in ways that are less easily recuperated. Number 87. The first Australians' astronomy and how it was ignored. Aboriginal Australians developed the world's oldest known astronomical tradition. The Yolngu people of Arnhem Land, the Wiradjuri of central New South Wales, the Barong of Victoria, and dozens of other nations each developed sophisticated astronomical traditions that were largely dismissed by European scientists who arrived in Australia, convinced they were encountering a pre-scientific people. Research by astronomers and anthropologists has documented an extensive body of astronomical knowledge embedded in Aboriginal traditions, including detailed knowledge of the movement of stars, the Milky Way, and other celestial phenomena, accurate methods of navigation by stars, observations of stellar phenomena including supernovae and variable stars that predate European observation by centuries, and sophisticated cosmological frameworks that integrated astronomical observation with ecological and ceremonial knowledge. This knowledge, accumulated over tens of thousands of years, was systematically ignored by European scientists who arrived in Australia, convinced they were bringing knowledge to a people who had none. The acknowledgement of Aboriginal astronomy as a genuine scientific tradition by mainstream Australian science and education is a recent and still incomplete development. Number 88. The land grab of the pastoral era, the pastoral expansion that followed the settlement of New South Wales and spread across the continent in the 19th century, was fundamentally a land grab of enormous scale that transferred the most productive land on the continent from the communities that had managed it sustainably for generations to a new class of private landowners who held it under titles issued by a government that had no legitimate authority to grant them, conducted without any legal basis or negotiation with the people whose land was being taken. Squatters moved onto land ahead of any government survey or legal process, established themselves with their livestock, and then used political influence to obtain licenses and later freehold title for land they had simply occupied. The Aboriginal people who had managed that land for thousands of years were displaced through a combination of violence, disease, and the destruction of the ecological systems on which their lives depended. The pastoral industry that was established on this taken land became one of the foundations of Australian economic development and of some of the country's greatest family fortunes. Number 89. The Wheat Belt Clearing and the Salinity Crisis. The clearing of native vegetation across the Western Australian wheat belt for agricultural development in the 20th century produced one of the most significant environmental disasters in Australian history. The deep-rooted native vegetation that had evolved in the region over millions of years maintained a water table at depths that kept salt deposits, naturally occurring in the rock below, well below the surface. When the native vegetation was cleared and replaced with shallow-rooted annual crops, the water table rose, bringing dissolved salt to the surface. Dryland salinity now affects millions of hectares of agricultural land in Western Australia and has made significant areas unproductive. The process is largely irreversible with current technology. The clearing that caused it was government policy for decades, supported by subsidies and promoted as agricultural development. The same logic that economic development justifies environmental cost has been applied to vegetation clearing decisions across Queensland and other states, with similar long-term consequences for soil health and water catchment quality. Number 90. The unemployment of youth in regional Australia. Young people in regional and remote Australia, particularly in areas with significant Aboriginal populations, face unemployment rates many times higher than the national average. In some remote communities, youth unemployment exceeds 50%. The absence of economic opportunities in these communities is not a natural condition. It is the result of specific policy decisions, the failure to invest in education and training in remote communities, the collapse of employment in the pastoral industry following equal pay, the inadequacy of infrastructure that would support economic development, and the political economy of a federation in which the priorities of the eastern seaboard dominate policy. The consequences of chronic youth unemployment in remote communities, including welfare dependency, substance abuse, poor health outcomes, and the loss of young people to larger centres, are well documented and the subject of ongoing and largely inadequate government responses. Number 91. The political donation system and the lack of transparency. Australia's political donation system allows significant undisclosed influence on politics through donations below the disclosure threshold, which has varied over time and is not consistent across states. The lack of real-time donation disclosure, the ability to donate through multiple related entities to stay below thresholds, and the inadequacy of the Australian Electoral Commission's enforcement capacity have all been documented as creating opportunities for undisclosed political influence. Major donors, including property developers, mining companies, and financial services companies, are represented among the largest donors to both major parties. The connection between political donations and policy outcomes, while rarely provable in specific instances, creates an environment in which the interests of significant donors are systematically favored over those of less politically connected constituencies. Number 92. The lobbying industry and the revolving door. Australia has a significant political lobbying industry, and the movement of senior politicians and public servants into lobbying roles and of lobbyists into government roles is a documented feature of Australian political life. Many state and federal politicians, after leaving office, take up positions with companies or industry groups whose interests they were responsible for managing while in government. Former ministers become lobbyists for the industries they were responsible for regulating. The revolving door between government and the lobbying and consulting industries creates conflicts of interest that are regulated inadequately by post-separation employment rules that are widely considered insufficient. The Senate's inquiry into lobbying regulation has recommended significant reforms that have not been implemented. The practical effect is that Australia's political class is systematically more responsive to well-resourced commercial interests than to the general public, a dynamic that is measurable in policy outcomes across multiple sectors. The register of lobbyists maintained by the federal government captures only a fraction of the influence operations directed at government, because significant lobbying activity occurs through channels that do not require registration. Number 93. The superannuation system and the people it leaves behind. Australia's superannuation system, introduced in the 1980s, was the result of a deal between the Hawke Labor government and the trade union movement, in which union members agreed to forego wage increases in exchange for contributions to a mandated retirement savings system, meaning that the retirement savings of ordinary Australians were built partly from wages they chose not to take and expanded through the 1990s and 2000s. Is widely regarded as one of the world's best retirement savings systems. It has accumulated trillions of dollars in retirement savings and provides most Australians with a much more secure retirement than would otherwise be possible. But the system leaves significant groups of people behind. Women, who are more likely to have career interruptions for caring responsibilities and to work in lower paid and casual employment, accumulate significantly less superannuation than men on average, and many retired women face poverty. People who work in the gig economy or in casual employment below the earning threshold for compulsory superannuation contributions may accumulate little or nothing. The system mirrors and amplifies the inequalities of the labour market rather than addressing them. Number 94. The mental health crisis and the inadequate system. Australia has a significant and growing mental health crisis, with high rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide, and the structural underfunding of mental health services relative to the documented burden of disease is one of the clearest examples of a government knowing the scale of a problem and consistently choosing not to allocate the resources required to address it, particularly among young people, men, and Indigenous Australians. The mental health system is chronically underfunded relative to the burden of disease. Wait times for specialist mental health services are long. The availability of accessible, affordable care in regional and remote areas is severely limited. The suicide rate among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians is approximately twice the national rate. Young men are at particularly high risk, and the cultural expectation of stoicism among Australian men contributes to low rates of help seeking. The government's mental health expenditure as a proportion of the health budget is lower than most comparable countries. Multiple inquiries and reports have documented the inadequacy of the system and recommended significant investment. The investment has not been commensurate with the documented need. Number 95, the sexual violence crisis and the justice system's failures. Australia has significant rates of sexual violence, and the gap between the prevalence of sexual violence in the population and the rate at which perpetrators face legal consequences is one of the most significant failures of the Australian justice system, with 1 in 5 women having experienced sexual violence since the age of 15, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The conviction rate for reported sexual assault is extremely low, with most reports not resulting in a charge and most charges not resulting in a conviction. The investigation and prosecution of sexual violence has been criticised by advocates and researchers as inadequate, with low reporting rates reflecting justified concerns among survivors about re-traumatization, about not being believed, and about the inadequacy of the justice system's response. The evidence-based approaches to improving conviction rates and supporting survivors have been identified in numerous inquiries, but implementation has been slow and inconsistent across jurisdictions. Number 96, the offshore resource revenues that leave Australia. Australia is one of the world's largest exporters of natural gas, coal, and iron ore. The revenue generated by the extraction of these resources is distributed between the companies that extract them, the state and federal governments through royalties and taxes, and in the case of liquefied natural gas, to a remarkably limited degree through the petroleum resource rent tax, which has been structured in ways that have allowed major LNG projects to generate enormous export revenues, while paying minimal tax to the Australian government for years. Australia exports vast quantities of liquefied natural gas to Asia. The Australian government receives relatively little tax revenue from it because of the structure of the petroleum resource rent tax, the deductibility of project costs, and the carry forward of losses. The resources belong, in the legal framework, to the Crown, which means the Australian people. The return to the Australian people from their gas resources has been widely criticised as inadequate. Number 97. The water licenses, controversy and the cotton industry. The Murray-Darling Basin water controversy has a specific dimension involving the cotton industry of the Northern Basin. Cotton is an extremely water-intensive crop grown in an arid environment. The expansion of large-scale irrigation cotton farming in the Northern Basin, particularly along the Darling River and its tributaries, has been associated with the extraction of water at levels critics argue have contributed to the death of river reaches and the catastrophic fish kills that have occurred in the Darling at Menindee Lakes. The allocation of water licenses to cotton farmers, particularly large corporate farming operations with significant political connections, has been the subject of investigation and allegation. The political influence of the irrigation lobby has shaped water policy in ways that critics argue favour extraction over environmental sustainability. Number 98. The ongoing dispossession in the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory intervention of 2007 compulsorily acquired 5-year leases over approximately 60 Aboriginal communities, were without consent and without compensation as part of the emergency response. The acquisition of these leases gave the government control over land that was the subject of existing Land Rights Act grants. The manner in which this was done, bypassing normal legal processes and suspending the Racial Discrimination Act, was consistent with a pattern of treating Aboriginal people's legal rights as less important than the government's policy agenda. The land was eventually returned, but the intervention established a pattern of treatment of Aboriginal communities as problems to be managed rather than as communities with legal rights and the capacity for self-determination. Number 99. The distance between sorry and change. The history of Australia is a history of a country that has found it easier to apologise than to change. The National Apology of 2008 was sincere and emotionally significant. The Closing the Gap framework was designed with genuine intent. Reconciliation has been a stated goal of Australian governments for 30 years, and yet the incarceration rates keep rising. The children keep being removed from families. The suicides in custody keep happening. The housing and health gaps remain. The distance between the formal acknowledgements, the welcome to country ceremonies and the apologies in the constitutional preambles, and the material reality of Aboriginal life in Australia in the 21st century is the defining moral failure of contemporary Australian democracy. The 99 truths told in this video are not a complete catalogue. They are a sample. They are an invitation to keep asking the question that Australian public life has always found most uncomfortable. Not what happened in the past, but what is happening right now and what are we going to do about it? 99 truths about Australia that the school curriculum preferred you never examine too closely. A nation built on extraordinary natural beauty and genuine human resilience is also built on massacres, stolen children, racial exclusion, broken promises, and a political class that spent 2 centuries protecting wealth over people. Knowing this is not hatred of Australia, it is honesty about it.